Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Given it's the holiday season when some people have a bit of extra downtime, I thought it'd be fun to do something a little different and make a list of my favorite games outside of the Age of Empires franchise. Considering how much time I put into AoE2 analyzing it for videos, you might assume that list is just a bunch of similar games, like Command and Conquer, Empire Earth, Company of Heroes, etc., and that I'm hyper fixated on RTS games. On the flip side, maybe because of how much I play AoE2, if anything, I actually gravitate toward games that give a different sort of experience, with maybe a few aspects like resource management and empire building being common themes throughout. Now, as one limitation for this list, I've decided to only include PC games that you can find for under $25 US. And at least with the current Steam sale going on until January 4th, these games should all be in that range, or drop below that level regularly. Starting off, my number 10 favorite game outside the Age of Empires franchise for under $25 is one called Banished. This is a relatively niche game these days with about a 20th the active player base of AoE2, and you can get it for around $7 US on sale at the moment. The premise is you're building a medieval town from the ground up, which maybe sounds familiar, though this game takes it in a very different direction than AoE2, having no combat of any kind, and instead focuses just on a more fleshed out city building and resource management aspect. I would go as far as even call it a survival city builder, forcing you to balance various professions, tons of resources including tools and clothing, as well as keep an eye on your age demographics. This has some interesting implications, as a population boom in 1 year means not just a whole lot of new unproductive mouths to feed, but also a wave of retirements down the road at some point that you need to plan for. It's a pretty chill game to play with a podcast in the background, and has some great mods for extra flavor and complexity once you have your feet under you. The only real issue for me is that given the nature of the game, there isn't really an end goal. But still, it's a great game, and I highly recommend checking it out if it sounds like your kind of thing. Next up, at number 9, is probably the most out there on the list, and for me it's one called 7 Days to Die, which also lands in that under $10 range when it's on a big sale. Now this is nothing like Age of Empires 2, I freely admit, and is basically a more intense zombie survival version of Minecraft. You collect resources, build tools to collect resources faster, make forges to produce higher quality items, and then loot to find weapons, all while fighting and sneaking around zombies who walk during the day and run at night. While there are many comparable horror survival games out there like The Forest, what sets 7 Days to Die apart for me is that every 7 days in-game you have what's called a Blood Moon Horde, where at sundown waves of zombies appear all night and know exactly where you are, breaking through any traps or walls to get to you. It's a cool mechanic that forces you to constantly be planning your fortifications in the days leading up to a Horde night, while then having those defenses regularly challenged by the game, increasing in difficulty each time. It also works as a co-op game if you prefer, which, similar to Minecraft, I think makes the experience even better, and lets you focus on just the aspects of the game that you want to do. Maybe your friend prefers resource collecting and base building, while you prefer looting and exploring, for example. Moving on to number 8, we have Tropico 4. There is a Tropico 5 and 6 with their own changes, though in my opinion 4 is the best, and you can get it again for under $10 US during a Steam sale. Now I've played lots of city builders and enjoy city skylines and surviving Mars for example, but I have to say Tropico 4 is my favorite casual city builder, and at the same time probably one not a lot of people know about. The premise is you create a character that's a Cold War era dictator of a tropical island, and over several decades build up your island nation, making tons of money, while navigating relationships with major world powers, and trying not to get nuked. The main appeal for me is just the light and very fun tone of the game. The fundamental gameplay is so forgiving and easy that every mission in the very long campaign have to come up with some outlandish restriction or demand for you to adapt to. If you give your character the Booze Baron perk to double the price of exported rum, you just print money, and it's a fun, low-stress game with a vibe pretty similar to The Sims that just always puts me in a good mood. Next up, at number 7, we have a game called FTL, which if it's 75% off during a Steam sale, you can get for around $2, but is actually a really high-quality game. The premise is you're on a ship trying to outrun an enemy fleet, and as you try to escape them, you encounter and fight or help other ships, saving up scrap resources to trade for weapons and upgrade your ship before a massive final boss battle. Most battles are pretty straightforward through the game, and you can pause at any time to plan your moves, but there's a lot of depth in what systems you're targeting, what combo of weapons and upgrades you focus on in your own ship, where you really get to make the ship your own. There's a lot of randomness in whether the right weapon or upgrade shows up when you can afford it, but it's challenging fun, and the biggest tip I can suggest is don't mess with the giant spiders. Of all the games on the list, this is the only one I've considered making a video playing on the channel, loading up a crew of Patreon supporters, and seeing how far we get. Moving on to number 6, we have Middle-earth: Shadow of War, which is a few years old at this point, and you can sometimes snag for up to 85% off, putting it even under $10. The closest comparison I think would be the Arkham series, if you're familiar with that, and this pick definitely shows my own personal preference, as it's set in the Lord of the Rings universe, which I'm a huge fan of. Where similar sorts of action role-playing games like The Witcher or Knights of the Old Republic tend to keep things relatively grounded and your character rarely feels completely broken, Shadow of War takes the fantasy element over the top, giving you abilities like shooting arrows to ghost teleport to enemy locations, and generally has zero pretense of being realistic. It does destroy any bit of Tolkien canon it touches, but it's still incredibly fun, and unabashedly just you being a superhero in the Lord of the Rings universe, which I'm 100% here for. If you're a big enough fan to have read the Lord of the Rings books, even if this isn't your usual style of game, I'm pretty confident you're gonna love it. Next up, at number 5, I'm going very mainstream, but for me, it's Civilization 6. With Civ 7 upcoming in 2024, this is going on massive sales at the moment, up to 90% off the base game on Steam. Admittedly, it took me a while to warm up to this more than Civ 5, but at this point, I've about doubled the hours played on it, and I'd say it's my favorite entry in the series. I've actually probably spent more time watching YouTube channels like Marbazier or Potato McWhiskey play it than put hours into it myself. But if you're into AoE2, this is definitely one to check out if you haven't already. Admittedly, it's more popular than AoE2 by active Steam players, so I imagine most of you have heard of it. In case you haven't checked it out, it's a turn-based 4X game where you manage cities, armies, research, and diplomacy. The beginning land grab portion of each game is especially fun, and admittedly the late game can start to drag a bit as you get tons of units and cities to manage every turn. But by the same token, some of the late game wars can also be pretty epic if you pick the right difficulty and no one's run away with things. Moving on to number 4, we have Hearts of Iron 4, which on a 70% sale can come out to a little under $15 US these days. I wanted to include one Paradox game, and to me this is the best. The premise is you control one country as the world ramps up for World War II, and you manage everything from construction projects, research, politics, supply lines, army deployment, factory production of what weapons and specific variations are being built, while always in the back of your mind planning what country you're going to fabricate a claim on and backstab next. There's definitely a learning curve like with any Paradox game, and a lot of mechanics to figure out, but once you get a handle on things, the replayability is absolutely endless. Have you ever wanted to lead a communist revolution in the United States and conquer the world? Well, now you can. Likewise, you can take control of Italy and finish what the Roman Empire started. I have about 140 hours in the game and still barely feel like I understand how to use navies at all. It's really one of those slow to learn and even slower to master kind of games, but the compelling time period and endless role-playing potential keeps me coming back. Plus, I just love the sound when you pick a new tech to research. Next up, at number 3, we get to a game that's fairly similar to Stellaris in some ways, though nowhere near as well known, and I actually prefer it, called Star Trek Armada 3. Now this isn't a standalone game, but instead an incredible mod for a game called Sins of a Solar Empire, which you can get on sale for around $15 US. Now I've actually never played the base game without this overhaul mod, but it's basically a 4X RTS game set in space, where you claim and develop planets, research ship types and upgrades before finally fighting it out in epic space battles, which is not a unique concept. I exclusively play this with the Star Trek Armada 3 mod though, which overhauls everything with a Star Trek theme set around the Voyager and Deep Space Nine TV show time periods, featuring Borg, Dominion, and the classic factions in the canon. For me, it's infinitely better than any official Star Trek game I've played, and builds off the foundation of a very old game called Star Trek Armada 2 from back in 2001. I should note there's also Star Wars mods I haven't tried, but if that's more your jam, is also an option. Admittedly, the game has a pretty steep learning curve, and the AI is brutally challenging on everything but the lowest difficulty, to the point even a co-op team of 3 allies who know the basics can really struggle against a single Borg on hard. But if you're a Star Trek fan, especially of the TV shows in the 90s, that experience is as epic as it sounds. Moving on to number 2, we're going to keep the space theme going, this time with RimWorld, which is actually a hard one to find on sale, usually going for just 20% off for about $25 US, making it the most expensive on this list. These days, it has about the same active player base as AoE2, so you've probably heard of it before, but if not, it's worth checking out. The premise is you're a group of survivors from a shipwreck who have to collect a handful of resources strewn around the map and try to build a life for yourselves. Ultimately, it's a construction and management game, where after you set up your colonists' priorities, they'll mostly do things on their own, though at any point you can jump in and take control, say if you're being attacked by passing raiders, wild animals, robots, or any number of natural disasters. Honestly, had this game come out before I started my YouTube channel, there's definitely an alternate universe out there where I would cover RimWorld instead of AoE2, looking into topics like the optimal seeds to plant and most cost-effective clothing to craft and sell. The depth of the game is incredible, and it also has hundreds of amazing mods with every theme you can think of, from medieval to Star Wars and Star Trek to just having magical characters. Now before we get to number 1, I have a few honorable mentions of games that didn't quite make the list. The first is the Stronghold series, as a classic from the original AoE2 era. It had a brand new definitive edition released this year that I got some early access to, and reminded me how good the game is, though I don't know if it's quite top 10 for me. I also want to mention Age of Empires 4, as by hours played, it's definitely ahead of a lot of this list for me, though from the outset I want to highlight other games outside the Age of Empires franchise. It had a rough launch, but has come a long way, and I've had quite a bit of fun with team games in particular. And finally, I want to mention Space Engine. This isn't so much a game per se as a mind-blowing space simulator. You don't build or technically do anything other than just explore a procedurally generated map of the galaxy, which includes a lot of the most famous stars and obviously our solar system in a lot of detail, all as far as I can tell at the correct scale. I originally found out about it because I was at one point thinking about making a space-themed YouTube channel, believe it or not, and came across it as a good way to make B-roll footage. But if you're looking for something a little slower pace that really gives the wow factor of experiencing other stars, worlds, and the distance you travel between them, it brings it to life and puts it into perspective in a way no video game or even documentary graphic ever really has for me personally. Now I realize this list has really outed me as a big space as well as a Lord of the Rings and Star Trek nerd, but has so far hidden how often I think about the Roman Empire. For that reason, my number 1 non-Age of Empires related game is Total War Attila. Though admittedly most of the Total War games are good, and like the Paradox games, I'm kind of putting them all together here. This game had its moment a few years ago with up to 75% sales these days, as Warhammer 3 is the main entry in the franchise by player count today, but Attila Total War is still my go-to. The grand campaign on hard difficulty as the Western or Eastern Empire start as a desperate defensive campaign set right as the Western Roman Empire completely collapsed historically, and there's nothing more satisfying than losing a ton of ground at the start to overwhelming numbers of enemies to then slowly turn things around and restore the Roman Empire. It's every Rome fan's dream with a fun campaign and the great battle simulations you expect from the franchise. I think everybody knows about the Total War series if you know about Age of Empires 2, but with over 400 hours on Total War Attila alone, it has to be my number 1, and is the best medicine in any moment I need to take a quick break from AoE2. So that's my list, which admittedly skews slightly toward older games, though the advantage of that is it's pretty easy to find basically all of them on major sales. I wouldn't argue this as a list of the best games ever or anything like that, and I don't have totally mainstream taste, but if you know a good one you think I'd like based on my picks, I'd be happy to take suggestions of other games to check out. That'll do it for this one though. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.